I wanted to tell you that, first of all, I want to thank you for coming, braving all the travel problems today with the snow. Second, I just wanted to tell you that we are having another program this evening in Deerfield, but if you are here for continuing legal education credits, you can't get credit for both programs because of the overlap. But I'm sure that you might still want, if you're not getting continuing legal education credit, you might want to go to the other program, depending on if you have more questions that we can't address here, if you're interested in other people's questions. The Center for Jewish Law and Judaic Studies here is the College of Law provides us facilities. It assists us in many ways, but it doesn't provide funding. And so we rely on to fund our programs, to pay honoraria, to pay for expenses, and so on. We rely on contributions, tax-deductible contributions from people who come. So if you can help us, sir, that's the plug I'm making for the organization. Today's program is about how the West, mostly, but the left of the West, turned on Israel. And before we begin, before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I just want to mention to you a couple of the legal developments, and I'll be happy to mention a little bit more at the end and to answer questions about them if you're interested, but some of the developments that are taking place. The National Lawyers Guild, for example, just recently was sued for discriminating against an Israeli organization for refusing to put an ad in its journal. Number two of the states, as you probably know, there are a number of states that have passed anti-BDS laws that either condemn BDS, the boycott, sanction, and divest movement or campaign, or they impose restrictions on states' investments in entities that cooperate or participate in BDS, or they prohibit state contracting under certain circumstances with people who participate in BDS. So there's a number of states, well over 20, closer to 25 than to 20, that have enacted such statutes. Two of them have recently been the subject of lawsuits that are continually going on. The one in Kansas resulted in a preliminary injunction against enforcement of the statute. And it's a very interesting case, and I believe that you should see the complaint for that case, I hope, is at the back of the materials you received today. About the materials, by the way, the first part of the materials is the preface to the paperback edition of Dr. Muravchik's book. Behind that, I think, is the complaint in the Kansas case. And there's also a case in Arizona. I'm somewhat involved in one of these cases, and so I'm not able to discuss them in detail.
The Arizona one.
Oh, it's the Arizona one? So the Arizona one is there? Okay, so the other one, I wanted to tell you that we didn't want to reproduce a whole lot of materials that would just get tossed by some people. So we want to give you a basic packet with the preface and with the complaint, but we want to send to people, whoever we have your email addresses, we're going to send you digital copies of substantial other material, including the preliminary injunction order in the Kansas case, the complaint in the Arizona case, and so on. So those cases are going on, and it's the ACLU which is, of course, representing the plaintiffs. So you have the National Lawyers Guild being sued for discrimination. You have the ACLU attacking the BDS statutes. And we have also a number of other federal legislation that are designed to help reduce the anti-Semitism created by and perpetrated by the BDS campaign. And on the other side of, that's to say, opposing this almost each one of these pieces of legislation is the ACLU. Now, much of the grounds are based on First Amendment concerns, and so that's traditional. That's not necessarily anything that associated with any tectonic change in the position of the ACLU. But it is sort of interesting that the efforts that are ongoing to try to help alleviate the rise in anti-Semitism are somewhat being frustrated on a continual basis by the ACLU. Again, there's a number of other developments that I can tell you about. Just one, there's no lawsuit yet, but in Massachusetts, in a high school, there was a professor who was disciplined, suspended for 20 days, because the professor had written a letter of recommendation to a college on behalf of a student. The student then posted a swastika on the school premises, and when another student asked him to take it down, he said maybe you should burn it like those Jews burned. And the teacher decided that he wanted to withdraw the letter of recommendation, and he contacted the university and said that he withdrew the letter of recommendation, and the school responded by disciplining the teacher. Sort of an interesting and problematic development. Having said that, we'll get to the meat of the program. So Dr. Joshua Muravchik, and you can see some of it after today if you're eager to see more of his materials. In addition to reading this excellent book, you can find his presentations on a variety of subjects on YouTube. He's a renowned international affairs expert, currently a distinguished fellow at the World Affairs Institute in DC, and formerly a fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and elsewhere. A Jewish Book Council review spoke highly of the book. You see the review quoted in these materials. You may have also received a letter from me quoting reviews from people like Dennis Ross, talking about how this is a book that was presented on an even basis, a balanced approach, and so on. Reviews by the highly enthusiastic reviews by Professor Dershowitz at Harvard and many, many others. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Dr. Muravchik.
Thank you, Professor Resnicott. It's very, I was coming to a university campus. I wondered if I would be greeted by a active and hostile audience of activist students, and instead I see a lot of friendly faces here. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Professor Resnicott, for inviting me. And I gather this center is the only one of its kind in the area, and I'm proud of you for creating it, and I'm proud to have the opportunity to participate in this program here. So I'm going to talk first somewhat about the general question that I address in this book, Making David into Goliath, which is how it came to be that Israel became the target of so much and such relentless international criticism and censure. And then I will focus in particular on the point which probably is the most important point that's underscored in the announcement of this event, which is the transformation of the political left in regard to Israel. What led me to write this book, or rather to research a question and then write this book out of what I felt I had learned from researching it, was my sense of shock at how dramatically international opinion had turned against Israel. It's very different than it was 50 or 60 years before. You recall, I think back to the 1950s and the novel Exodus, which is a kind of romantic, heroic account of the founding of Israel. It was the biggest bestseller in the United States since Gone with the Wind, and then was translated into scores of other languages and was a bestseller in other countries, embodying a kind of warm and admiring view of the young Israel. And this also came out in the next decade at the time of the Six-Day War, when there was overwhelming support for Israel in the United States, but throughout the West. There were public opinion polls that showed, when respondents were asked, which side do you sympathize with more, Israel or the Arabs? In all countries, a fair number of people didn't answer or said, I don't know, or neither. But among those who had a choice one way or the other, in the United States, the polls ran 15-1 in favor of Israel. And in England and France, they ran 30-1. In the United States, that has shifted over the years, but in England, France, and everywhere in Europe, that has more than shifted. It's completely reversed. And I can't think of any other example in history where a country has experienced such a radical transformation in the way it is treated and looked upon by the rest of the world, with the exception of countries that had revolutions and the nature of their government went from black to white or white to black, or whatever, and then people felt differently toward that country. But Israel hasn't undergone a revolution. The Israel of today is the Israel of 50 years ago, when the attitudes that Israel received were so dramatically different than they are today. So I set out to try to understand how this can be explained, and I reached the following conclusions. For one thing, the 1967 war itself changed things dramatically. It changed the reality on the ground. Israel has never since experienced a moment at which it seemed so imperiled as it did on the eve of the 1967 war, when the Arab states were mobilizing their armies on Israel's borders and proclaiming their intent to wipe it out once and for all. Secondly, Israel ended that war occupying the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, and the part of the Golan Heights. And the Golan, less important, but the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, being the home to a significant number of Palestinian Arabs, or a significant number of Arabs who, really beginning with that war, began to think of themselves as Palestinians, which had not been the case before. In the decades leading up to the 1960s, the hot idea in the Arab world, the idea that students in coffee shops had excited discussions about all through the night, was Pan-Arabism, or Arab nationalism. Much in the same way that I think these last decades, the hot idea in that part of the world has been Islamism in its various forms. But from some point, let's say in the 1930s through the 1960s, it was Pan-Arabism, meaning the idea that all the Arabs should be united in a single state, and that by doing that, the Arab nation would become great and powerful again, and overcome the unhappy position in which the weak and downtrodden position that it felt itself to be in. And the leading exponent of this idea of Pan-Arabism was President Nasser of Egypt. And he was then, and I think remains to this day, the most popular leader the Arab world has ever produced. And you can still, if you travel there, as I do, you can still see his portrait on the walls in many different places in the Arab world, but much more so back then. He was, by the way, not at all reticent about saying in his writings about identifying who it was who he thought ought to be the leader of this Pan-Arab state. But the tremendous Israeli six-day victory in 1967 was, above all, a humiliation of Nasser. He was seen as the person behind the wall, this effort to destroy Israel, and therefore, in essence, the author of this overwhelming humiliation of the Arab world. And all of the air went out of the balloon of Pan-Arabism from that moment forward, and it gave rise to a lot of turmoil. And one thing that arose in that is a upsurge of Palestinian nationals. Until that point, there wasn't Palestinian nationalism, and for multiple reasons, in part because it's not in the sociology of that reason for people to identify primarily in those terms, in national terms, as opposed to identifying as Muslims, as Arabs, or as members of smaller units, tribes and families, but also because in the context of Pan-Arabism, there was talk of liberation of Palestine. The PLO had been founded in 1964, but the liberation of Palestine meant liberation of Palestine from the Jews. It didn't mean liberation to create a Palestinian entity or nationality. And in fact, the PLO was not the initiative of Palestinian Arabs. It was the creation of Nasser. It was one wing of the Pan-Arab national movement. But there was a miscellany of Palestinian young thinkers who deviated from that, and there was a little group that was formed in Kuwait, led by Yasser Arafat, that called itself Fatah, and which suddenly came to the fore in the wake of the 1967 defeat. And Fatah, which had been excluded from the PLO to that point, entered the PLO, took it over, Arafat becoming the head of the PLO within 2 years, and then began to raise this banner of Palestinian nationalism, and with dramatic success. And so the idea of the Palestinians as a people grew apace, and then suddenly that created a new situation, which was that Israel was not merely occupying some territories that it had seized from the countries that attacked it, but Israel was occupying Palestine and depriving the Palestinian people of their natural right to self-determination and to fulfilling their national identity. And so the conflict then between Israel and the Arabs was sort of overnight redefined from one in which the Arabs were trying to stop the Jews from having a state of their own, which they said quite plainly was their aim, to now it was the Jews trying to stop someone else, namely the Palestinian people, from having a state of their own. And this, of course, put Israel in a very different and much less friendly light. And yet, it's not possible, I don't believe, to infer from this that the fact that Israel now became an occupier and now was denying some other people their national fulfillment it's not possible to say that that is an adequate explanation for why there came to be so much anger and hostility directed at Israel in the contemporary world. Why is it not? Because this is not the only case of occupation. It's not the only case of a people whose aspirations for national fulfillment are being denied. There is, for example, Tibet, which has been occupied brutally for longer than the West Bank and Gaza have been occupied, with a conscientious effort to erase its national identity. And yet, when was the last time at any university in Chicago there was an angry demonstration against China and for Tibetan independence? I'm not from Chicago, I don't know, but if you know of one, I'd be interested to hear about it. Or in the Middle East, we have the case of the Kurds, which is much in the news today. Now, the Kurdish claim for national self-determination must be, unless all such claims are equal, must be seen as stronger than the Palestinian. For one thing, as I explained, the sense of Palestinian identity is only about 50 years old. I grant its legitimacy because if a group of people develop that feeling, that's almost automatically makes it legitimate. But the Kurdish sense of nationality is 1,000 years old. And also there are at least 5 times as many Kurds in the world as there are Palestinians. The Kurds have their own culture, their own language, their own history and traditions. If the Palestinians have such, it's certainly much shallower because they're not that linguistically or historically differentiable from the Arabs of the surrounding states. And yet, where, except for among the Kurds themselves, is there any passion for Kurdish independence, Kurdish self-determination, Kurdish nationalism? It seems that no one in the world gives a damn about this. So, and one could pile on other cases. So it just doesn't seem to me sufficient to say that the position that Israel was in after '67 of occupying and denying the Palestinians their self-determination is adequate to explain what happened. And so I think we must look to other factors, and I think I identified several, and I put them in 2 categories. On the one hand, there's just been the application of raw pressure, which led a lot of countries to change their diplomatic positions, and I think led a lot of individuals and publicists to change their way of thinking of it. First of all, came in the form of terror. The wave of terrorism in the 1970s, I'm not talking about terrorism within Israel, but terrorism in the international skies and terrorism on European soil that scared the daylights out of a great many European and other governments and individuals, and also out of moderate Arabs. They were so scared that almost no terrorist who was caught in the act in Europe and taken into custody was held in custody. That is, almost to a man and woman, they were released within a few weeks or months because the European countries were afraid to hold on to them They're afraid that would anger the Palestinian terrorist groups. And we have now confessions that there were any number of quiet deals made between European governments and the various Palestinian groups to direct their terror at Israel, and they would get a more friendly reception and away from the Europeans, and they would get a more friendly reception, the Palestinian cause would, from the Europeans. A second form of pressure by intimidation was the oil boycott that accompanied the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And that really brought several countries to their knees and scared the bejesus out of others, and led to statements by European leaders, the frank statements that we have to adjust our policies because we are dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And a year later, in '74, Kissinger, then our Secretary of State, did a tour of European capitals trying to rally our allies in Europe on some common plan to prevent the oil exporters from being able to do that again. There would have had to have been some plan of counter threats, I think. And he hit a brick wall. He wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Every minister I consulted was still terrified of possible confrontation with the oil producers," close quote. And he threw up his hands. So there was this tremendous pressure brought to bear. And then also a different kind of pressure, I think, is that the Arabs learned to more effectively use their numerical advantage. They've never learned to translate it into might on the battlefield, but they learned to translate it into political leverage. And this was, there's how many Jewish states in the world? There's one. How many member states of the Arab League? 22. How many member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation? 55. And so it's just in human beings, for each Jew in the world, there are 100 Muslims. And these numbers are really quite overwhelming. And as the Arabs got more effective at using this inherent leverage, they translated it into political victories, particularly in the United Nations. We just saw there's a great deal of publicity about the General Assembly's vote to censure the United States for recognizing that Israel's capital is Israel's capital. And I saw numerous news reports saying, this is a tremendous rebuke and so on. But Abbott even once said, if an Arab state would present to the General Assembly a resolution saying the earth is flat and it was Israel that flattened it, the vote in favor would be overwhelming. And indeed, a big part of what the General Assembly does every year is pass resolutions denouncing Israel. And there are routinely 2 votes against Israel and the United States, and then there are a handful of Pacific Island states that are very dependent on the United States, that are members of the UN, Nauru and Palau and the Marshall Islands, and they'll also often vote with the United States so to make 3 or 4 or 5 votes against this resolution. Perhaps more important than General Assembly resolutions, the UN has created 3 special bodies devoted to extolling the Palestinian cause and lacerating Israel. 2 of these are special committees, but one of them is a division of the Secretariat, meaning that it's an office with a staff and a multi-million-dollar budget, to which we are the biggest donors, and it's this division of Palestinian rights in the UN Secretariat that actually was the launching pad for the BDS movement. This division holds international conferences quarterly in different venues around the world devoted to excoriating Israel and promoting the Palestinian cause in different ways, including by promoting BDS. So on the one hand, there were these various kinds of pressures brought to bear to push the world to take a less friendly view of Israel and to instead support the Palestinian cause. But then, probably more important, at least I think equally important to these material pressures that were brought to bear, was an intellectual shift. An intellectual shift that was not just about the Israel-Arab conflict, that was not engineered by the Arabs or the Muslims. There was something going on in the global zeitgeist, but that had profound implications for how the Middle East conflict was viewed. And that was a post-World War II transformation in the dominant image of social justice. For a century before then, the dominant image of social justice was largely Marxian. It had other formulas, but the idea of the poor against the rich, or the workers against the owners, that the poor, the workers, however defined, were the downtrodden, were the people with a grievance, and moreover, the people whose liberation would liberate all of mankind. Stuff that my friend Richard here knows I believed in when we were both in high school. And the idea of social justice wasn't all Marxist, but this Marxian formula really captured the heart of it. It was a kind of bastardization of a much more ancient Christian idea that rich man won't go to heaven, or is as likely as a camel to go through the eye of a needle, and so on. But a bastardization because it was focused on conflict and violence in this world, not some ultimate redemption in the next. But that gave way, I believe, in the years after World War II, to a new dominant image of social justice that was not based on economic classes, but rather on race, ethnicity, nationality. And this grew out of the anti-colonial struggles of what we came to call the Third World, or the developing world, but of Asia and Africa and the Middle East. Peoples who had been ruled by European colonialists and now were rising up demanding their independence and their equal rights. And this captured the modern imagination, and it was reinforced by something else, which was the struggle of American blacks for civil rights. This was a different struggle, but But it was a struggle that captured the imagination of the world. It was a remarkable and noble, nonviolent struggle, and America is the most watched country in the world, so it too symbolized the struggle of dark-skinned people against white oppressors. And I think the civil rights movement in the United States and the anti-colonial movements in the territories that had been colonized were kind of rolled together into one ball of wax, which was sometimes called the rest against the West, or the struggles of the people of color against the white oppressor. And this, I think, came to be sort of more up-to-date, more exciting, and more dominant in the minds of people concerned with fighting for social justice than the old class struggle idea, which seemed a little bit exhausted. And if this is the lens through which you view the world, and you turn this lens on Israel and the Arabs, well, Israel is, or at least appears to be, the white European people, and the Arabs and Palestinians are the people of color, and the latter are inherently right. The former are inherently wrong, because one side of the good guys, one side of the bad guys. And I think this inherence is important. I think back to my high school days, and I confess even some years after, when I was a Marxist, socialist, and believed that the struggle of the workers was the most important redemptive thing going on in history. And from that vantage point, let's say there was a strike somewhere, it would never have crossed my mind to ask the question, well, what are the issues? What is the union asking for? What is the employer offering? Let's look at the details of this. I'd never have thought of that for a moment, because it was, any strike was, the workers were right, because the workers were history's good guys, and the employers were the bad guys. And in this new social justice trope, you don't stop to look at, well, what are the Israelis doing? How are they behaving? What are the Palestinians doing? Who's willing to settle on what terms? Those details are irrelevant. There are white hats and black hats. There are people who are blessed by history and people who need to get out of the way. And I think this is really the largest single factor that has transformed how Israel and its enemies are seen. And you know, what all of this, I think, misses is, what do we mean by social justice? It is, I said, Marxism was kind of a bastardization of an older Christian idea of redemption of the poor. And this new race-based social justice is a further bastardization of Marxism, I think. And it, instead of looking at the substance of political and social arrangements, it just designates certain people by virtue of the language they speak or the color of their skin as being good guys or bad guys. But I would beg to take social justice seriously. And if we were to do that, what does social justice mean? What are the arrangements between human beings that would constitute social justice? And I think it's probably never been put better than in the French Revolution. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. freedom, equality, and brotherhood. Three luminous goals that I, for one, would like to see practiced and enjoyed by people everywhere and in every country. And if we say that social justice has this substantive meaning, and then we turn our lens on the conflict between Israel and the Arabs, or Israel and the Palestinians, we see a rather dramatic picture, namely regarding freedom. Israel is by far the freest country in the Middle East. It's been from its birth a democracy. It's rated every year by Freedom House as a free country. And most Freedom House has a scale from 1 to 7, which it rates every country in the world on how free it is. 1 being the most free, 7 the least free. And Israel ordinarily gets a 1.5 rating. I saw that it recently got a 2. And yet, if you look on the other side at all the Arab countries, I calculated both their mean and their median score, and it's 5.5 out of a possible 7. That is, they are way over at the unfree end of the spectrum. And we have one hopeful case now in the Arab world of Tunisia, which is the one changed regime that has survived from the Arab Spring of 2011. But even that is hanging by a thread because of widespread adherence to Islamism and a great deal of terrorism there. Let's hope that endures. But and in particular, if we look at the Palestinians, we now see President Abbas in, I've lost count. Someone here must know offhand. In the 11th year of his 4-year term as president, and on the other hand, in Gaza, ruled by Hamas, that gained that rule in part through elections, which have not been held again, and in part through throwing the members of Fatah off roofs of buildings. And each side notorious for, in the areas it rules, for the suppression and torture of the members of the other side, that is Hamas and Fatah. Fatah ruling the West Bank, Hamas ruling Gaza. If we go from the question of freedom to equality, equality is a more complicated idea. It has many components to it. When the French revolutionaries used the term, they meant social equality. Every person a citizen with some inherent equal status. Israel is, if anything, a paragon of that. That is, Israel, famously informal, is a country where employees address their employers, and soldiers address their officers, and students address their professors by first name, bespeaking a kind of easygoing sense of equality. The Arab world, if you know it, is extremely hierarchical. When I've occasionally taught, not whole semesters, but taught a week at a time or something in Arab students, and I've received the most warm reactions and receptions from them. And I sort of try to ask why, and they said, well, you talk to us. Our professors would never dream of talking to a mere student outside of class. It would be a loss of stature to do that. You can look at equality in terms of gender, where Israel is probably the most or one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. The role of women in the military in Israel is distinct. The role of women in politics in Israel is greater than in almost any other country. And also, if you look at the earnings of women as compared to men, according to UN figures, the Israeli women as a whole in their lifetime earnings are 67% that of men. In the United States, the figure is 62%. It's in the low 60s. In the OECD countries, it's in the high 50s. And in the Arab countries, it's 22%. And you can talk about equality vis-a-vis the rights of gays. Again, Israel has one of the most accepting regimes in terms of non-persecution of people for being gay, and also the service in the military, and also the right to adopt children, and so on. The one trick is gay marriage, because all marriage in Israel is by, there's no civil marriage, it's all by clerics, and there aren't clerical authorities who will, of any of the faiths, who will marry gay couples, but in fact, gay marriages are recognized in Israel if they've been performed outside. If you compare that to the Arab world, it's again night and day. That is, most Arab countries not only don't accept gay marriage, gay adoption, and so on, but actively persecute people for being gay, and have criminal penalties in several, including the death penalty, simply for sodomy, for engaging in a homosexual act. And then there's a question of ethnic equality. A tougher one for Israel, in a sense, because there are differences between Jews and Arabs in all kinds of socioeconomic indicators. Jews earn more, they have higher levels of education, they have better health statistics. But if you look closely at these, what you see is that in most cases the differences are small. For example, in health, the life expectancy of Jewish Israelis is about 3 years longer than the life expectancy of Arab Israelis. But the life expectancy of Arab Israelis is longer than in any of the Arab countries, and it's also longer than the life expectancy of Americans. It's really pretty good, and just slightly below what prevails for Jews. If you look at things like earnings and education, you'll see on average educational attainment, Jews in Israel are 15% higher level of attainment than Arabs in Israel. But if you look at Jews in other countries, the difference is even greater. In the United States, the educational attainment of Jews is 40% higher than the rest of the population. And the same roughly is true for earnings, etc. In short, if equality is one of the benchmarks of social justice, Israel's record is extremely admirable, and the record of all the Arab countries is quite poor. And we can say much the same for the idea of brotherhood. Israel has practiced brotherhood in numerous ways, starting with integrating Jews of all different sorts and languages from all different places, including at least 3 whom were little heard of, who appeared claiming to be lost tribes. And I'm speaking of the Bukharan Jews, the Ethiopian and the so-called B'nai Menashe of India, integrating all of them into one vibrant society. And secondly, in terms of the treatment of the Arab citizens of Israel, which is not nearly perfect, includes discrimination, includes prejudice and hostility that they endure, but nonetheless also includes a great effort to recognize and their role in society, which you can see in terms of street signs and labels on food and what have you. Arabic is an official language of Israel. You can see in the form of Arabs who serve in all kinds of different capacities in Israel, in diplomacy even, and compare it to the situation of Jews in the Arab countries. Well, you can't really do that because there are more or less no Jews left in the Arab countries because they were all driven out and wouldn't survive if they attempted to go back. And you can also compare that to the treatment, both in Israel and the Arab countries, of people who are neither Jews nor Arabs. For example, the treatment of the Baha'i, who are viciously persecuted in Iran, where the religion originates, and also persecuted in the Arab countries. Or, for example, in Egypt, which is traditionally one of the more liberal in its culture, liberal Arab countries, you can't, in your identity papers, be a Baha'i. Baha'is are, against their will, listed as Muslims. And I did a book about liberals in the Arab world, and I was particularly taken with the bloggers. This was about a decade ago. It was a big new voice in the Arab world were bloggers, especially among Egyptians. And I was very amused by a blog of angry protest against this rule that Baha'is must be listed against their will as Muslims in their identity papers. And this blogger, who was a kind of clever and defiant guy, said, "Do you realize what this means? It means that you some random Muslim, that you'll be tricked one day and your sister will end up marrying a Baha'i," except the blogger used saltier language than marrying. But as you all probably know, the center of the Baha'i faith happens to be in Haifa, and this is not the only example of Israel's acceptance of others. And I could go on multiplying the examples, but the point is freedom, equality, brotherhood. If you were to take the idea of social justice seriously, it's something more than just a trope meaning a somehow redemptive, bloody struggle of history's good guys and history's bad guys defined by race, then Israel is the paragon of social justice in the Middle East. But sadly, that is not recognized, at least it's not recognized by people who identify themselves as motivated above all by the quest for social justice. And so this combination of this intellectual transformation and the concrete pressures that I mentioned before that were brought to bear from numbers and oil and terror, the combination of the intellectual change and these material pressures, I think, work to bring about this dramatic change in which Israel is so often censured and vilified around the world, while in no sense deserving it. So thank you for listening so long. I went on a little bit long because I was told in advance that this is for students and getting credit, and so I had to be more in that mode. Thank you for tolerating it, and